Okay, let's unpack this. You know how some places just feel like they hold layers and layers of history, shaped fundamentally by their geography and the constant movement of people?
Absolutely, like a palimpsest, almost.
Exactly. Think about a land right at the very heart of a continent, crisscrossed by major rivers like the Rhine, the Danube, and the Elbe.
Vital waterways.
But, crucially, without those really strong natural barriers like big mountain ranges or coastlines on all sides.
That description perfectly fits the area we know today as Germany. Our sources for this deep dive paint a picture of a history marked by incredible fluidity, deep fragmentation, persistent conflict, and yet remarkable resilience.
Resilience, yeah.
It's the story of a land and an identity that have been constantly redefined across millennia.
Absolutely. And our mission today is to dive deep into this rich historical overview of Germany, to pull out the most important insights, the surprising facts, and give you that shortcut to understanding the incredible, complex journey this nation has taken.
Sure to cut through the noise, yeah.
And where better to start than at the very, very beginning? What incredible ancient traces were found in this region?
Well, if we think about this land being a crossroads from the earliest times, our sources tell us that paleontologists have found traces of early hominid habitation in the area we now call Germany, going back almost 50 million years.
50 million years. Wow, that's what you call deep roots.
Seriously deep. That's evidence of ancestors of modern humans who migrated from Africa, reaching this region incredibly early.
That's staggering. And it's not just about those ancient ancestors. We also learned about the Neanderthals, famously named after the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, where their remains were first discovered back in 1856.
Right, the type specimen.
The analysis of sites in Germany shows they weren't just some simplistic early humans. They were robust cousins of modern humans, really well adapted to the Ice Age conditions.
Tough conditions.
Crafting sophisticated stone tools, effectively using fire in their cave dwellings. They were survivors.
That's right. And they weren't the only group inhabiting this area for long. Around 40,000 years ago, another wave of migrants arrived. Early modern humans, sometimes called Cro-Magnons.
Okay.
The sources note that they lived alongside the Neanderthals in this region for a time, and recent archaeological finds in Germany have provided significant new information about these prehistoric peoples. Coexistence, maybe competition. It's fascinating stuff.
Here's where it gets really interesting and maybe surprising. The sources point to recent discoveries prompting some archaeologists to propose that an area on the Swabian Alb in southern Germany—
Ah, yes, the flutes and figurines.
Exactly. May have been where early humans first discovered music and perhaps even art itself, around 35,000 years ago. I mean, the idea that music and art might have originated in southern Germany that far back. What makes that particular finding stand out to you?
Well, what's fascinating here is how profoundly that finding supports the idea of this region as an ancient crossroads, a place where new ideas and peoples met and developed. It wasn't isolated.
Right, a melting pot, even then.
Precisely. This area has always attracted migrants. After these early humans, Celtic peoples inhabited the region, drawn by its rivers and forests. And later, Germanic tribes migrated in from the east, gradually supplanting the Celts and settling throughout the area, bringing their own languages and customs. Always movement.
Moving forward dramatically in time, let's look at the period when the Romans arrived on the scene. How did they view those Germanic tribes living across their borders in the shadowy land they called Germania?
The Roman view. Well, as described in our source, it was largely negative, stereotypical, really.
Also,
They saw the Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube as frightening barbarians, often bent on destruction, wild, unpredictable. They built frontiers like the Limes Germanicus, partly to keep them out.
but modern scholarship, highlighted in our source, offers a much more nuanced view, doesn't it? It wasn't just about raiding barbarians.
No, not at all. It emphasizes the crucial role these Germanic tribes played, not just as raiders, but in creating the hybrid civilization of medieval Europe after the Roman Empire eventually collapsed. They were part of the transition.
So how did that interaction along the frontier actually play out? It wasn't just a hard border.
Definitely not. The frontier wasn't just a barrier. It became a site of vibrant cultural and economic exchange, a contact zone.
Okay.
Roman garrison towns like Moguntiacum, which grew into modern Mainz, Augusta Treverorum, now Trier, and Augusta Vindelicorum, today's Augsburg, were established in pacified areas.
The Roman settlements within Germania.
Well, on the edges, integrated into the frontier system. The source notes these towns fostered a degree of assimilation and laid the very foundations for Germany's rich urban life in the Middle Ages. Seeds planted early.
And as the might of Rome began to falter, particularly from the late 300s CE, and troops were pulled back to defend the heart of the empire, what happened then?
Well, that created a vacuum, didn't it? Germanic tribes began to raid the Roman provinces with greater frequency. Some even settled within Roman territory.
Oh, interesting. So integration, but maybe forced.
Sometimes forced, sometimes negotiated, often providing military service to Rome in exchange for land and resources. Federati, they were called.
Right.
The sources highlight a key moment. The Goths routing the Roman army at Adrianople in 378 CE, forcing the emperor to grant them significant land concessions. A real shock to the system.
This decline of Roman power opened the door for the rise of new tribal kingdoms. The Franks, in particular, rose to prominence.
They certainly did, and their conversion to Roman Catholicism under their leader Clovis is often presented in historical accounts like the Chronicle of St. Denis as this divine event, a holy miracle.
Like Constantine seeing the cross in the sky.
Something like that, yeah. The story goes he promised to convert if God granted him victory in battle.
But the sources also mention some perhaps more worldly motivations behind that conversion. What were those?
Well, what's fascinating here is how Clovis's conversion served a very practical purpose. Shrewd politics, really.
How so?
By adopting Latin Christianity, the same faith as most of the former Roman population in Gaul, he effectively united both the Romans and the Germans under his leadership.
Bridging the gap.
Exactly. This gave his kingdom a crucial cohesion that other Germanic kingdoms, often led by Arian Christian overlords, a different branch of Christianity, lacked.
So it wasn't just about faith, but about consolidating power.
Precisely. His subsequent military campaigns against neighboring tribes like the Thuringians and Alemanni also facilitated their conversion, expanding his influence and strengthening his realm. Religion and politics deeply intertwined.
And this connection between Germanic rulers and the Roman Church continued and deepened, especially with the Carolingian dynasty, forging that significant symbiotic relationship with the papacy after Pepin the Short received papal blessing for his coronation.
That alliance was absolutely crucial. Shifting our focus now, we see this relationship continue and evolve with the Ottonian dynasty, starting with Henry III.
Okay, the Ottonians.
The source explains how he managed the powerful regional nobles. He bound them through feudal allegiance, but allowed them to retain significant tribal authority, a balancing act.
Which sort of set the stage for decentralization later.
Exactly. This approach was key in setting the stage for the decentralized political structure that would come to define the Holy Roman Empire, which he helped found. His son, Otto the Great, secured considerable support with his major victory over the Magyars at Lichfeld in 955.
Right, that was a big one, seen as saving Christendom.
A crucial check on invasions from the East, definitely, boosted his prestige enormously.
Yet despite these early successes, the Holy Roman Empire, which astonishingly lasted for 1,000 years in various forms.
Incredibly long time, yeah.
It was fundamentally marked by that decentralized political structure you mentioned. Imperial power often declined under subsequent dynasties, like the Hohenstaufen. Emperors such as Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II were frequently distracted, weren't they?
Very much so. Often by costly campaigns aimed at asserting their authority down in Italy. The Italian distraction, some call it.
And this focus on Italy had significant consequences back home in Germany.
Huge consequences. The sources note that emperors were often forced to make concessions to the powerful German princes simply to gain their allegiance and support while campaigning abroad.
Trading power for troops, basically.
Essentially, yes. Trading imperial authority for security and manpower. Then, after Frederick II's death, you get the chaotic period known as the Great Interregnum from 1256 to 1273.
Interregnum, no agreed-upon emperor.
Right, and during that time, these centrifugal forces accelerated dramatically, cementing the princes' control over their own territories. Power just flowed away from the center.
So if there's one big picture takeaway from this long, complex period of the Holy Roman Empire, what is it for you?
For me, the crucial insight is this. For the vast majority of its history, the area that is now Germany was not a single unified nation-state like France or England.
Right, it was very different.
It was a fragmented land with fluid borders and persistent political instability. That decentralization, that power resting with numerous regional princes rather than a strong central emperor, is a defining characteristic that shaped Germany's trajectory for centuries. It's key to understanding everything that follows.
And this fragmented land was then hit by a series of immense crises, perhaps none more devastating than the Black Death.
Oh, the plague. Yeah.
It arrived in the mid-14th century during a period already marked by economic depression and famine, leaving the population incredibly vulnerable, right?
Absolutely. Bad harvests, hardship, they were already weakened before the disease even hit. The sources paint a truly grim picture of the devastation.
What was the disease itself?
Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas on rats, though that wasn't understood then, of course.
No, of course not.
It caused characteristic painful swellings called buboes, hence bubonic plague, and could also mutate into a pneumonic form spread directly person to person through the air. Much deadlier.
And the scale of the death was horrific. We read about stacking corpses in mass graves.
Terrible scenes. Breakdown of social ties as family members abandoned the sick out of fear. Physicians were utterly powerless, trying all sorts of remedies that didn't work.
What kind of mortality rates are we talking about?
Estimates suggest around 60% of those infected died. Maybe higher in some places. 60%. It's almost unimaginable.
Unimaginable.
And while the initial wave eventually burned itself out, the disease reappeared periodically for centuries. It left deep scars.
How did people cope? Or explain it?
Well, with medicine failing, many turned to religious or apocalyptic explanations. Flagellants whipping themselves, scapegoating minorities, fear and desperation were rampant.
And the sources make it clear that this period of immense suffering and societal breakdown, along with crises within the church itself, like the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism.
Right, the papacy in Avignon, rival popes, the church's authority was already shaky.
All this led Europeans to deeply rethink their religious life and their fundamental relationship with the established Catholic Church. Big questions were being asked.
Definitely. A crisis of faith, you could call it. This crisis fueled growing calls for reform within Christianity. Figures like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia openly challenged church authority and clerical privilege, arguing for scripture over tradition.
Precursors to the main event, really.
Exactly. While they were ultimately suppressed, Hus famously burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 1415, even with imperial safe conduct. A real betrayal.
Yeah, that was shocking.
Their individual voices could be silenced, but the broader calls for reform could not. These calls, rooted in widespread anti-clerical feeling and a hunger for a more personal, less institutional religious experience, would only grow stronger. People wanted change.
And that escalating desire for reform brings us directly to the spark that truly ignited everything, the Protestant Reformation.
Here we go, a turning point in European history, centered right in Germany.
Right. The sources highlight that the Reformation was much more than just a religious movement. It was a religious, political, and social revolution, largely centered right there in Germany.
Absolutely. It shook everything up.
The initial controversy, as many know, was Martin Luther's challenge to the sale of indulgences, particularly by Johann Tetzel, who was selling them quite aggressively.
As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. That was his jingle, basically.
Right. Selling forgiveness to fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Luther wasn't having it.
Not at all. And the spark was indeed the posting of his 95 Theses in Wittenberg in 1517, challenging the practice, inviting debate.
And the source emphasizes how quickly these ideas spread.
Incredibly fast, not just within the academic world, but broadly, thanks to the relatively new and increasingly widespread technology of printing. The printing press was key.
A game changer.
Totally. The Leipzig debate in 1519 was another crucial moment where Luther was cornered really, by Johann Eck into openly challenging the ultimate authority of the Pope himself. A huge step.
What's fascinating is how rapidly the conflict with the papacy escalated from there. Pope Leo X issued the papal bull Exsurge Domini in 1520.
Arise, O Lord, condemning Luther's writings.
Essentially demanding Luther retract 41 specific errors from his writings. And Luther's response in December 1520 was incredibly defiant, wasn't it?
Oh, massively defiant. It was a dramatic, symbolic act of formal rejection. He publicly burned the papal bull along with books of canon law.
Wow. No turning back after that?
Pretty much, signifying his complete break with Rome. This escalated the conflict to an irreversible point, leading to his summons to the Diet of Worms in 1521, the Imperial Diet.
Bring us to the Diet of Worms. Emperor Charles V summoned him, the most powerful ruler in Europe. Cardinal Cajetan demanded a simple retraction. Just say you were wrong. But Luther refused, famously asserting his stance. What were his core arguments there, and what did he say?
Well, at Worms, confronted with his books, Luther refused to recant unless he could be convinced of his error by scripture or plain reason. He wasn't going to bow to papal or council authority alone.
His conscience wouldn't let him.
Exactly. The source quotes his powerful assertion: "Unless I am convinced by scripture and by plain reason, I cannot and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. God help me, amen."
Here I stand. I can do no other. Though maybe he didn't say exactly that part.
Maybe not those exact words, but the sentiment was clear. It was a groundbreaking assertion of individual conscience and the primacy of the Bible over church hierarchy. Hugely influential.
And this assertion of sola scriptura, that the Bible is the ultimate authority, along with sola fide, the doctrine of justification by faith alone.
Faith alone, not works or sacraments.
These became the major hallmarks of Protestant theology, the core ideas.
Exactly. Luther's key treatises from 1520 were also incredibly impactful in spreading these ideas. Works like Address to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation.
Calling on the princes to reform the church.
Right. On the Babylonian captivity of the church, attacking the sacramental system, and on the freedom of a Christian, about faith and love, they laid out his theology in direct, accessible language.
And crucially, in German, right? Not Latin.
Yes. Printed in the vernacular German, they were enormously popular, selling out quickly. The source points out they appealed strongly to the German princes, not just for religious reasons, but by challenging the vast wealth and political power of the Catholic Church within their territories. It offered them more control.
But the calls for reform weren't limited to theologians and princes. The sources detail the Peasants' War, which erupted starting in 1524. What was fueling this rebellion?
This was a massive, widespread uprising. It was fueled by deep-seated resentment of the feudal system, heavy taxes, serfdom, lack of rights, and inspired in part by radical preachers who often interpreted Luther's ideas about Christian liberty in a much more social and political sense than Luther intended.
So they took freedom of a Christian, very literally applying it to their worldly situation.
Some certainly did. The rebels articulated a mix of economic, political, and religious demands, often basing them on their reading of the Gospels, citing concepts like brotherly love and divine justice. The 12 Articles of the Swabian Peasants is a key document here.
Luther found himself in a difficult position regarding the Peasants' War. He was initially somewhat sympathetic to their grievances, wasn't he? He criticized the lords, too.
He was, initially. He acknowledged some of their complaints were justified, but he became utterly horrified by the violence and radicalism of the rebellion as it spread, burning castles, killing nobles.
So what was his response then?
He responded with extreme condemnation, vehemently. The source quotes from his pamphlet, Against the Robbing, Murdering Hordes of Peasants, where he called on the nobles to brutally crush the rebellion. Smite, slay, and stab them, he said.
Wow, harsh words.
Incredibly harsh. He argued vehemently against demands for common goods, linking baptism to freedom of the soul, not freedom from serfdom or property obligations. He saw it as undermining all order.
The outcome was incredibly brutal, wasn't it?
Terribly so. The source notes the suppression was swift and merciless. The princes, Lutheran and Catholic alike, united to crush them. Estimates ranged, but potentially 100,000, maybe even up to 300,000 insurgents were killed.
That many. Good grief.
It led to a strong conservative backlash throughout Germany and effectively crushed the hopes for a widespread social revolution alongside religious reform. It really scared the authorities.
What happened next after the Peasants' War?
Yeah.
Did the religious conflict stop?
Oh, no, not at all. This period was followed by further conflict between Protestant princes, who formed the Schmalkaldic League for Defense, and the Catholic Emperor Charles V. This led to the Schmalkaldic War.
And the outcome of that?
It culminated in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. This treaty offered a fragile settlement based on the principle of cuius regio, ius religio.
And what exactly did cuius regio, ius religio mean in practice, and what did the Peace of Augsburg solidify for Germany?
It meant whose realm his religion. Basically, the ruler of each territory within the Holy Roman Empire could choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism as the official religion for that territory. Their subjects had to conform or leave.
So religious freedom for the princes, not the people.
Pretty much, yeah. While it brought a temporary end to open religious warfare between Lutherans and Catholics, it solidified the religious division of Germany. And crucially, it further cemented the power of the individual princes at the expense of any potential central imperial authority. More fragmentation.
And that Augsburg settlement proved incredibly fragile. You said temporary peace.
Very fragile. It didn't account for Calvinism, for one thing, which was spreading. The religious and political instability persisted, leading inevitably to the devastating conflict known as the 30 Years' War, which raged across Germany from 1618 to 1648.
30 years. A whole generation. The sources mention Calvinism as a new complicating factor.
Yes, Calvinism became another significant form of Protestantism. Some princes, like Frederick III of the Rhineland-Palatinate, adopted it. This added another layer of religious difference and provided some princes with a new ideological basis to challenge the authority of the Catholic Habsburg emperor. It wasn't just Lutheran versus Catholic anymore.
The immediate trigger for the war, as the source recounts, is a rather famous event. The defenestration of Prague in 1618. What happened? Sounds dramatic.
It was pretty dramatic. In Prague, rebellious Bohemian Protestants protesting the Catholic Habsburgs' efforts to re-Catholicize their lands and restrict their religious freedoms, they threw 2 imperial governors and their secretary out of a high window at Prague Castle.
Threw them out the window. Did they survive?
They did, actually.
Yeah.
Reportedly landed on a dung heap or sloping ground below, which cushioned the fall. A rather undignified but significant start to what would become a continent-spanning conflict. Symbolically huge.
Definitely makes a statement. The Protestants then elected Frederick V of the Palatinate, a Calvinist, as King of Bohemia, explicitly challenging Emperor Ferdinand II. What was the result?
Frederick's reign was incredibly brief. He was quickly crushed by the Imperial and Catholic League forces at the Battle of White Mountain near Prague in 1620.
So he didn't last long.
Nope. Earned him the moniker Winter King for his short time on the throne before being forced into exile. This early Catholic victory, however, didn't end the war. It just escalated it, drawing in other powers.
The war's cost, especially for civilians in Germany, was immense. The sources highlight the sack of Magdeburg in 1631 as a horrific example.
The sack of Magdeburg was a truly terrible atrocity, even by the brutal standards of the time. The city, a Protestant stronghold, was besieged by imperial forces under Tilly, captured, and then systematically looted and burned.
What happened to the people?
Over 20,000 inhabitants were slaughtered, men, women, children. The source notes it took 14 days just to clear the bodies by throwing them into the Elbe River. It was a horror that deeply shocked Germany and galvanized Protestant resistance, became a rallying cry.
And here's a chilling detail from the source that really underscores the fear and anxiety gripping the land during this period, especially in the midst of war. The peak of witch hunts.
Ah, yes. The witch craze intensified dramatically during the war years, particularly in Catholic prince-bishoprics in southern Germany.
Why then? What's the connection?
Extreme stress, social breakdown, economic hardship, religious fervor, looking for scapegoats. All fueled the paranoia. The source quotes a letter to the Prince-Bishop of Würzburg from 1629 describing widespread accusations affecting people of every rank and sex, nay, even clerics. No one felt safe.
It mentions a specific case.
Yes, the execution of a 19-year-old maiden, universally praised for her modesty and purity simply because she was accused of witchcraft. It highlights the utter terror and injustice.
That detail really brings home the human cost of this era of conflict and instability.
Yeah.
The way fear could just override reason and justice.
Completely. The war itself eventually drew in most European powers, Denmark, Sweden, France, fighting battles across German lands. It caused widespread devastation, depopulation through fighting, famine, and disease across Germany. Some areas lost over half their population.
Unbelievable destruction. How did it finally end?
The conflict was finally ended by a series of treaties known collectively as the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Exhaustion played a big part.
And what was the lasting impact of the Peace of Westphalia on Germany's structure and identity?
Crucially, it formally confirmed the fragmentation of Germany. It essentially reaffirmed the principles of Augsburg, but extended them to include Calvinism.
So princes could choose Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist now.
Yes. And it granted rulers within the Holy Roman Empire almost full sovereignty over their own territories, including the right to make treaties, weakening the already diminished authority of the emperor even further. It solidified the mosaic of hundreds of independent states that made up Germany, delayed unification for centuries.
Amidst this fragmented landscape, one power began its slow but steady ascent, Brandenburg Prussia. Under figures like the Great Elector, Friedrich Wilhelm, how did this state start to build its strength?
Well, Brandenburg Prussia had suffered badly in the war, but the Great Elector was very shrewd. He was instrumental in building a strong standing army, a professional bureaucracy, and a centralized administration. He focused on efficiency and military power, laying a crucial groundwork for a more absolute, disciplined form of rule that would characterize Prussia.
Making the state strong from the center out.
Exactly. Building the foundations.
A significant step in Prussia's rise was when Elector Friedrich III crowned himself king in Prussia in 1701. Why was that title change important? It sounds subtle.
It wasn't subtle in terms of prestige and signaling. The title king signaled a higher status and greater sovereignty than elector. The Holy Roman Emperor sanctioned the title, notably King in Prussia, not King of Prussia, as part of his territory was outside the empire in exchange for support in the War of the Spanish Succession.
Ah, a political deal.
Yes, and it symbolized two things: Prussia's growing military and political might, and conversely, the emperor's declining authority, willing to grant such a title for political expediency. Prussia was on the map as a serious player.
Then came Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great, starting as a seemingly rebellious prince interested in arts and philosophy.
Yeah, he clashed with his very militaristic father, the soldier king, ran away even.
He proved to be a formidable military and political leader when he took the throne. What was his impact on Prussia's standing?
Oh, huge impact. Frederick II was a brilliant, if sometimes ruthless, military strategist and statesman. He significantly expanded Prussian territory and prestige, most notably by launching the Silesian Wars against Austria almost immediately after taking the throne in 1740. He used a flimsy treaty pretext to seize the valuable, resource-rich province of Silesia from Maria Theresa of Austria, and he held on to it through subsequent wars. That really put Prussia on par with Austria as a major German power.
Shifting gears now, alongside these political and military developments, Germany was also experiencing a significant intellectual movement. Tell us about the German Enlightenment, or the Aufklärung.
Right, the Aufklärung. It was Germany's version of the broader European Enlightenment, emphasizing reason, tolerance, and human progress. The sources mention key thinkers.
Like who?
Figures like Christian Thomasius, who used rational arguments and was instrumental in helping to end witchcraft prosecutions in German universities. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a polymath famous for philosophy, his idea of the best of all possible worlds, and for co-inventing calculus.
And later figures.
And later, giants like Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Moses Mendelssohn, and Immanuel Kant, who explored ideas of reason, religion, individual liberty, and the limits of human knowledge. Kant, especially, is monumental.
Lessing is particularly highlighted for his advocacy for freedom of thought and religious toleration, shown in plays like Nathan the Wise, a stance that even drew protests and censorship in his time, right?
Indeed, he pushed boundaries. And we see some rulers adopting elements of this intellectual movement in what's termed enlightened absolutism.
Enlightened absolutism. Sounds like a contradiction.
It kind of is. Rulers like Frederick the Great himself and Joseph II of Austria pursued progressive reforms. Frederick styled himself the first servant of the state. Joseph advocated religious toleration, attempted to reduce aspects of feudalism, promoted education.
So using Enlightenment ideas.
Yes, guided by what they saw as rational principles. But, and this is the absolutism part, they often did so autocratically, imposing reforms from the top down, without consulting traditional institutions or respecting established customs.
So reason imposed by decree.
Pretty much. The sources note they rejected the idea of a social contract based on popular consent and sometimes met resistance from their subjects precisely because they disregarded existing traditions and liberties in their pursuit of rational reform. Everything for the people, nothing by the people was the motto.
This period takes us to the turbulent era of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. His campaigns had a seismic impact on the fragmented German lands, correct?
A truly seismic impact, more than anything since the 30 Years' War, maybe. Napoleon's rise and his military campaigns led directly to the dissolution of the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire in 1806. Just gone.
Wow. End of an era. How did Napoleon assert his dominance and reorganize the region?
He established his dominance by repeatedly crushing coalitions of German states, especially Austria and Prussia. He fundamentally reshaped the German map.
In what way?
He abolished scores of tiny states and free cities, consolidating territory. He reorganized many of the remaining German states under the Confederation of the Rhine, which was essentially a French protectorate, a puppet state providing troops for his armies.
And Prussia. How did they fare?
Prussia, despite its recent rise under Frederick the Great, suffered a crushing defeat at the twin battles of Jena-Auerstedt in 1806. They lost significant territory, parts of which were reorganized into the Kingdom of Westphalia under Napoleon's brother Jerome, a real humiliation.
Napoleon's eventual defeats, first the disastrous invasion of Russia, then Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, and finally Waterloo, led to the Congress of Vienna in 1814-1815, where the European powers attempted to restore order. What new structure was established for the German states?
After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna aimed to create a stable balance of power and suppress revolutionary ideas. For the German states, they created the German Confederation, Deutscher Bund.
What was that exactly?
It was an Austrian-led league made up of 39 states, a significant reduction from the hundreds of entities in the old empire, but still very fragmented. It was designed to maintain stability, but it wasn't a unified nation.
And the sources note a key tension within it.
Yes, the two dominant rivals within this confederation were Austria, which held the presidency, and Prussia. Both were major European powers whose power bases lay largely outside the confederation itself, in Hungary, Poland, etc. This rivalry between Vienna and Berlin would shape the next 50 years, setting up future conflict.
Despite this conservative order, engineered by figures like Austria's Prince Metternich to maintain the status quo and suppress liberalism and nationalism.
Yeah, Metternich was all about preventing another revolution. Censorship, spies, the whole apparatus.
Revolutionary impulses began stirring among the German bourgeoisie, the middle classes, students, intellectuals. What were these ideas and what did they agitate for?
These were the powerful ideas of liberalism and nationalism, often intertwined. Liberals sought constitutional government, guaranteed civil liberties, freedom of the press, and parliamentary representation. Nationalists yearned for a united German nation-state, free from foreign influence and the fragmentation imposed by the princes, ideally governed by some form of popular sovereignty or parliamentary democracy. They wanted Einheit und Freiheit, unity, and freedom.
This agitation culminated in the Revolution of 1848, sparked by similar movements across Europe, starting in France.
Yeah.
What was the attempt to unify Germany that came out of this revolution?
Yes, the revolutionary wave swept across the German states in March 1848. This led to the convening of the Frankfurt Parliament, a gathering of elected delegates from across the German states who met in St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt.
What was their goal?
Their ambitious goal was to draft a liberal constitution for a unified Germany. After much debate, they produced a constitution and even offered the imperial crown of a unified constitutional Germany to the King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm IV.
A pivotal moment. But the revolution ultimately failed. What symbolized that failure, and what was the consequence?
A key symbol of the failure was the Prussian king Friedrich Wilhelm V's refusal of the offered crown in 1849. He famously called it a crown from the gutter, a crown made of mud and clay, reeking of revolution. He wouldn't accept legitimacy from an elected assembly.
Though he rejected the people's offer.
He did. Lacking support from the major powers like Prussia and Austria and facing counter-revolution from the restored conservative forces, the Frankfurt Parliament ultimately collapsed. Troops dispersed the remaining delegates.
What was the main consequence of this failure?
The source emphasizes that this failure led to a crucial split between liberals and nationalists, or at least a disillusionment among liberals. The dream of achieving a liberal, united Germany through peaceful parliamentary means died. Many talented liberals emigrated, especially to the U.S., the 48ers.
So the important takeaway is that the path to unification would not be through peaceful liberal reform, but instead be marked by conflict and autocracy, driven by that intense rivalry between Austria and Prussia that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Unity would come, but not with liberty, at least not in the way the Frankfurt Parliament envisioned.
Precisely. And this period also saw rapid industrialization accelerating dramatically in the 1850s and 60s, particularly centered in the Ruhr region, but also Saxony and Silesia. The growth in coal mining, iron and steel production, and the expansion of railway systems transformed Germany's economy and society.
Laying the groundwork for future power.
Absolutely, providing the economic muscle, the sinews of war that would be crucial for Prussia's eventual success and Germany's emergence as a major industrial power rivaling Britain.
Which brings us to the architect of that autocratic unification, Otto von Bismarck. Appointed minister president of Prussia by King Wilhelm I in 1862 during a constitutional crisis over army reform. What was his mindset and his goal?
Bismarck was a brilliant, pragmatic, and deeply conservative statesman, a Junker, an East Prussian aristocrat. He had an authoritarian mindset. little patience for parliamentary liberalism. His singular goal was the unification of Germany, but under Prussian leadership, preserving the power of the monarchy and the traditional elite.
And his method wasn't debate, was it?
No. Famously, he declared that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches and majority votes, that was the mistake of 1848, but by blood and iron, meaning military force and industrial might.
He certainly used military might. The sources briefly mention conflicts he orchestrated or skillfully maneuvered Prussia into.
Yes, a series of short, decisive wars. First, the Second Schleswig War in 1864, allied with Austria against Denmark to gain control of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein.
Setting up the next conflict.
Cleverly, yes. Disputes over managing those duchies provided the pretext for the Austro-Prussian War, or 7 Weeks' War, in 1866. Prussia's modernized army, better tactics, and use of railways led to a swift victory, most decisively at the Battle of Königgrätz, or Sadowa.
And the result of that war.
It decisively ended Austrian influence among the German states. Prussia annexed several North German states and formed the North German Confederation under its leadership, excluding Austria. Southern German states remained independent, but were tied to Prussia by military alliances.
But Bismarck still needed to bring the southern states, like Bavaria and Württemberg, fully into the fold. He provoked war with France to do that. What was his calculation there?
Bismarck believed a war against a common external enemy, France, was necessary to overcome the southern states' reluctance and trigger nationalist sentiment, uniting them with Prussia. The source quotes his calculation. "We must fight. It is most important that we be the ones attacked." He needed France to look like the aggressor.
How did you manage that?
He skillfully manipulated the Ems dispatch, a telegram about the Spanish succession crisis involving a Prussian prince, to make it sound like the Prussian king had insulted the French ambassador, and vice versa. He leaked this edited version, knowing it would inflame public opinion in both countries.
And France declared war.
Exactly as he'd hoped. And he was confident in Prussia's superior military planning, its rapid mobilization capabilities developed by the highly effective chief of the general staff, Helmuth von Moltke the Elder.
And the Prussian and Allied German victories were incredibly swift and decisive in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71.
They were stunningly fast.
Yeah.
Battles like Weissenberg, Wörth, Spichern, Gravelotte, and then the decisive Battle of Sedan quickly overwhelmed the French forces. The source details the siege of the French army at Metz and the capture of Emperor Napoleon III himself at Sedan. It effectively ended major French resistance just weeks into the conflict, though Paris held out under siege for months longer.
And one of the most seminal events in German history then took place, not in Germany, but in France, as a direct result of this victory.
Yes, the culmination of Bismarck's plan, the proclamation of the German Empire, Deutsches Reich, on January 18, 1871, and the location was deliberately chosen for its symbolism.
Where was it?
In the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, the historic seat of French royal power. The source quotes the Prussian King Wilhelm I's declaration accepting the title of German Emperor, Deutscher Kaiser, from the assembled German princes. This act symbolized Prussia's triumph, the unification of Germany, excluding Austria, and the dramatic shift of power in Europe.
The new German Empire quickly rose as a dominant power and economic powerhouse in Europe.
Absolutely. Under Bismarck's chancellorship until 1890, it consolidated its position. Its industrial output rapidly surged, fueled by innovation, a strong education system, and population growth. It surpassed Britain's industrial output in key areas like steel by the early 20th century, becoming second only to the United States in overall industrial production and exports.
What regions drove this?
Regions like the Ruhr Valley and the Saar Basin were industrial heartlands, coal and steel giants. And the unification was significantly boosted by incorporating the industrial areas of Alsace and Lorraine, which were annexed from France after the war, a source of lasting resentment in France.
Moving into the period after Bismarck was dismissed by the young Emperor Wilhelm II in 1890, the Wilhelmine era, what characterized German policy and society?
The source highlights a shift. While Bismarck had focused on consolidating Germany's position and maintaining peace through complex alliances, Wilhelm II favored a more assertive, ambitious foreign policy, Weltpolitik, or world policy. This era saw more overtly conservative and militaristic policies, a stronger emphasis on national prestige and power.
Contrasting with the brief, more liberal hopes under his father Friedrich III, who died after only 99 days on the throne.
Exactly. Friedrich III was seen as potentially ushering in a more liberal era, but his early death changed that trajectory. The Wilhelmine period was one of intense nationalism, rapid industrial growth, but also growing social tensions and a more aggressive international stance.
And that rampant nationalism sometimes had a darker side, didn't it?
It certainly did. Historians like Heinrich von Treitschke are mentioned as influential figures who inflamed patriotic passions, sometimes with strident exclusionary rhetoric. He supported suppressing socialism, pushed for acquiring a large colonial empire, and openly challenged Britain's global dominance. "The Jews are our misfortune" was one of his infamous phrases.
So anti-Semitism was part of this nationalist mix. The source highlights this troubling element growing during this time. How was the identity of assimilated German Jews viewed by ardent nationalists?
The sources note that even though German Jews were increasingly assimilated, participating fully in German economic, cultural, and scientific life, they were often seen with suspicion by ardent nationalists. Their distinct religious and cultural identity, even if minimized by many, was sometimes viewed as a divisive threat to national unity.
How did this manifest?
They were often associated with perceived challenges to traditional values: liberalism, socialism, modern art, and culture. This led to growing social discrimination, exclusion from certain positions, like the officer corps, and the rise of explicitly anti-Semitic political parties and publications, though they remained on the fringes of power before 1914. Still, the undercurrent was there.
The assertive foreign policy, like the expensive naval arms race with Britain initiated by Admiral Tirpitz and supported by Wilhelm II, is a clear example of this period's increasing international tensions, right? Building a fleet to challenge the Royal Navy.
It certainly was a major source of friction with Britain, contributing to the complex web of alliances and rivalries that eventually led to war. And when World War I broke out in August 1914, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the source notes there was widespread, almost universal enthusiasm across Europe, including Germany, the spirit of 1914. It was fueled by intense nationalism, romanticized notions of warfare, a belief in the superiority of one's own nation, and expectations of a swift, decisive victory, home by Christmas.
But the reality was brutally different.
Terribly, tragically different. The initial swift plans, like Germany's Schlieffen plan to knock out France quickly by swinging through Belgium, failed. The war on the Western Front quickly bogged down into brutal, static trench warfare. Miles of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea.
Unimaginable slaughter followed.
Yes. Battles like Verdun and the Somme in 1916 became synonymous with futile attritional warfare, costing hundreds of thousands of lives on all sides for minimal strategic gains. Over 1 million men perished or were wounded at the Somme alone.
The sources include descriptions from soldiers that really convey the horror.
They do, mentioning bodies caught on barbed wire in no man's land, looking as if they were praying, the relentless constant shell fire, the mud, the rats, the lice, the omnipresent death. Yet, despite these horrific conditions, the sources also note the remarkable, almost unbelievable resilience and endurance of the soldiers on all sides.
Deadly new weapons were introduced in futile attempts to break that stalemate. Machine guns dominating the battlefield. Massive artillery bombardments, poisonous gas, tanks later on.
Yes, technological advances only amplified the slaughter and the misery. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Germany achieved more success against Russia, eventually leading to Russia's collapse after the Bolshevik Revolution. Germany imposed the harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918.
What was the impact of that treaty?
While it gave Germany vast territory in the East, the source notes its extremely punitive terms provided the Allies with powerful propaganda about German war aims. It also shattered the remaining wartime consensus within Germany, showing the government's annexationist goals and leading to crippling strikes by war-weary workers. The home front was cracking.
This devastating war, ending in defeat for Germany in November 1918 after the failure of its final spring offensive and the arrival of fresh American troops, ultimately led to the collapse of the German Empire. The Kaiser abdicated, and the Weimar Republic was established.
Germany's first real attempt at a nationwide democratic government, proclaimed in November 1918, with a constitution drafted in Weimar in 1919.
But it faced immense challenges from the very beginning, didn't it?
Huge challenges. The sources detail immediate political instability. There were uprisings from the far left, like the Spartacist revolt in Berlin in 1919, brutally suppressed. There were attempted coups from the far right, like the Kapp Putsch in 1920. Political assassinations of figures like Matthias Erzberger and Walter Rathenau created a climate of fear and violence.
And the economy.
Economic chaos, burdened by war debts and the harsh reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles, which also assigned Germany sole guilt for the war, a source of deep resentment the Republic faced crippling inflation. This culminated in the hyperinflation of 1923, where money became virtually worthless, wiping out middle-class savings and causing immense hardship.
So political violence, economic ruin, national humiliation, fertile ground for extremism.
Exactly. All of this created fertile ground for political extremism from both ends of the spectrum. The Communist Party grew, but so did numerous radical right-wing nationalist groups.
And amidst this chaos, one group rose to prominence: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party.
Precisely. The source identifies the Nazi Party, led by the fanatical orator Adolf Hitler, as a radical fascist group that skillfully exploited the post-war turmoil, the resentment over Versailles, the economic hardship and fears of communism. They offered simplistic solutions, scapegoats, especially Jews, and the promise of national renewal.
Despite failed early attempts, like the beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923, for which Hitler was briefly imprisoned,
Where he wrote Mein Kampf, laying out his hateful ideology.
the sources explain that the Nazis ultimately gained power not through revolution, but through political maneuvering within the Weimar system, especially after the Great Depression hit Germany hard from 1929 onwards.
Right. Unemployment soared, desperation grew, and voters turned to extremist parties. The Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag by 1932, though still without a majority. Through backroom deals involving conservative politicians who wrongly thought they could control him, Hitler was appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933.
Effectively marking the end of the fragile Weimar Republic.
Yes. The descent into totalitarian dictatorship under autocratic Nazi leadership was incredibly swift after that. Within months, democracy was dismantled. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the pretext for emergency decrees suspending civil liberties. The Enabling Act in March granted Hitler's government sweeping legislative powers for 4 years, effectively dissolving the parliament's authority. Dictatorship established.
Dissent was brutally suppressed. The sources detail how quickly other political forces were eliminated.
Systematically. The Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party were outlawed and their members arrested, sent to the first concentration camps like Dachau. Independent trade unions were banned and replaced by the Nazi German Labor Front. State governments were dissolved or taken over, centralizing all power in Berlin under Hitler.
Even potential rivals on the right?
Eliminated, too. During the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, Hitler purged the leadership of the SA, his own stormtroopers, who he feared were becoming too powerful, and killed numerous conservative opponents. This consolidated his control and made the Nazi Party the sole legal political organization in Germany. Total control.
Simultaneously, the racist oppression of Jewish citizens began immediately in 1933 and escalated systematically.
Yes, it was central to Nazi ideology from the start. Jewish civil servants, jurists, university professors, and educators were quickly removed from their posts under the guise of the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Jewish businesses were boycotted.
And it got worse.
Much worse. This initial discrimination escalated into intensifying legal and social persecution. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their German citizenship, forbade marriage or relationships between Jews and non-Jews, and defined Jewishness based on ancestry, not religious practice.
Then came physical violence.
Yes, culminating in the orchestrated nationwide pogrom of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938, where synagogues were burned, Jewish shops looted, and scores of Jews killed or arrested and sent to concentration camps. This was followed by systematic economic expropriation, social segregation, and increasing attacks, killings, and deportations.
Did many Jews manage to leave?
The sources note that around half of Germany's Jewish population, some 250,000 to 300,000 people, managed to emigrate in the 1930s to escape this intensifying persecution, though finding countries willing to take them became increasingly difficult.
Hitler's foreign policy was equally aggressive, clearly aimed at dismantling the Versailles Order, rebuilding military might, and conquering Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe for German settlement.
Yes, the sources detail this aggressive expansionism step by calculated step. It began with repudiating the disarmament clauses of the Versailles Treaty and withdrawing from the League of Nations in 1933, followed by openly rearming Germany from 1935.
Testing the waters.
Exactly. Then came the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, violating Versailles again, while Britain and France failed to react forcefully. The Anschluss, or annexation of Austria, in March 1938. Then the demand for the Sudetenland, German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia, which was appeased by Britain and France at the Munich Agreement in September 1938.
Peace for our time. But it didn't last.
Not at all. In March 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Finally, after signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin's Soviet Union to secure his eastern flank, Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. That triggered declarations of war from Britain and France, starting World War II in Europe.
This aggression, particularly the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, led directly to the Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored genocide of approximately 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe.
Yes. The Holocaust, or Shoah, was the horrific culmination of Nazi anti-Semitism. The sources describe the ghastly system of ghettos, concentration camps, and dedicated extermination camps. Most infamously, Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland, built specifically for mass murder.
The process itself was nightmarish.
The arrival process at camps like Auschwitz was ruthless industrial killing. The SS selected victims upon arrival. The aged, young children, pregnant women, and the feeble were often sent immediately to be murdered in gas chambers disguised as showers. Others deemed fit for forced labor were stripped, their heads shaved and tattooed with numbers, their identities erased. They faced starvation, disease, brutal work, and arbitrary killing.
The source includes a poignant detail about Anne Frank and her family.
Yes. Discovered in their hiding place in Amsterdam, they were deported to Auschwitz in 1944. Anne and her sister Margot survived the initial selection there, but endured inhumane treatment before being transferred to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where they both died of typhus just weeks before its liberation. Her father, Otto Frank, was the only family member to survive Auschwitz. He later published her diary,
which became such a powerful and enduring symbol of the human tragedy of the Holocaust, read by millions.
Indeed. And the sources emphasize that the Nazis' victims of mass murder and persecution also included millions of others. Roma, Sinti and Roma, Soviet prisoners of war. Millions died through deliberate starvation and neglect. Polish and other Slavic civilians, political dissidents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the mentally and physically disabled murdered in the T4 euthanasia program. The Holocaust remains a crime of unparalleled scale and depravity in human history.
The turning point of the war for Germany came in the winter of 1942-43 at the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front.
Yes, a desperately costly, brutal battle of attrition where the Soviet Red Army finally halted the German advance deep into Russia, encircled and destroyed the entire German Sixth Army. A catastrophic defeat for Hitler.
A turning point on other fronts, too.
Absolutely. Stalingrad, coupled with the Allied victory at El Alamein in North Africa around the same time, marked the beginning of the end. Allied forces pushed from North Africa into Sicily and Italy in 1943. And then the massive D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious operation in history, finally opened the long-awaited major Western Front.
Squeezing Germany from both sides.
Exactly. Allied armies pushed relentlessly towards Germany from the west, while the Soviets advanced overwhelmingly from the east. This led to the eventual fall of the Third Reich, Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker in April 1945, and Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. Utter defeat and devastation.
In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Germany was left utterly shattered, occupied, and fundamentally divided.
Completely shattered. Physically, economically, morally. The sources note the agreement made by the Allies, the U.S., Britain, the USSR, and France initially at Yalta, and finalized at Potsdam to partition Germany and its capital Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, into 4 occupation zones. Supreme authority rested with the 4 Allied commanders.
The challenges facing the occupation powers and the German population were immense, weren't they? Just survival must have been hard.
They were overwhelming. The Stunde Null, the 0 hour, feeding and housing a population devastated by war, millions homeless from bombing, dealing with millions of ethnic German refugees expelled, often brutally, from former German territories in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere in the East, alongside countless other displaced persons, former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, rebuilding a country from physical and moral rubble amidst chaos and desperate scarcity, denazification. It was a monumental task.
And the different approaches and ideologies of the wartime allies quickly became clear, leading to a hardening division, not cooperation.
Exactly. The wartime alliance crumbled rapidly into Cold War hostility. The Soviets established a communist state in their eastern zone, consolidating control through the Socialist Unity Party, SED. This became the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, formally established in 1949, characterized by nationalized industries, collectivized agriculture, and a powerful, pervasive secret police, the Stasi.
And the West?
In contrast, the Western allies, US, Britain, France, merged their zones economically and fostered democratic governments and capitalist enterprise. This coalesced into the Federal Republic of Germany, or FRG, commonly known as West Germany, also formally established in 1949 with its capital in Bonn. Germany was split in two.
That growing animosity and fundamental ideological split was starkly symbolized early on by the Berlin blockade and the subsequent Berlin airlift.
A major early Cold War crisis. The Berlin blockade was the Soviet attempt in 1948-49 to force the Western powers out of Berlin by cutting off all land and water access to West Berlin, which was an island of Western influence deep within the Soviet zone.
How did the West respond?
The Western allies, led by the US, responded with the incredible Berlin airlift, supplying the over 2 million people in West Berlin entirely by air for almost a year. Food, fuel, everything. It was a massive logistical feat and a huge political victory for the West, demonstrating their commitment. It became a key symbol of the Cold War division of Europe.
The two German states were formally established in 1949. In West Germany, key figures emerged, like Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor and leader of the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU. What was his focus? He was chancellor for a long time.
Adenauer dominated West German politics until 1963. His primary focus, as detailed in the sources, was on achieving sovereignty for West Germany, rebuilding its devastated economy. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, happened under his watch, led by Ludwig Erhard, anchoring the FRG firmly in the Western Alliance and regaining international respectability. Reconciliation with France was key.
And West Germany did indeed integrate quickly into the Western Alliance structures.
Yes, very successfully, from Adenauer's perspective. West Germany joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1955, allowing it to rearm under integrated command. And it played a leading role in European economic integration, becoming a founding member of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and the European Economic Community, EEC, the precursor to the European Union, by signing the Treaty of Rome in 1957, tied firmly to the West.
Meanwhile, the division was physically brutally cemented. The Berlin Wall was built by the GDR in August 1961.
A desperate measure by the East German regime. The wall was built literally overnight to stop the massive flow of emigration from east to west, particularly skilled workers leaving for better opportunities and political freedoms in West Germany via West Berlin. Hundreds of thousands were leaving each year. The GDR was bleeding talent.
What was the impact of the wall?
It became the starkest, most infamous physical symbol of the Cold War division. The Iron Curtain made concrete. It cut off families, ended free movement, and led to tragic deaths of people trying to escape over it in the following decades. For decades, West Germany officially refused to recognize the GDR as a legitimate state, adhering to the Hallstein Doctrine, which threatened diplomatic sanctions against any country except the USSR that did.
Within West Germany itself, the Adenauer era eventually gave way to political shifts and the emergence of significant protest movements in the 1960s.
Indeed, stability wasn't static. Events like the Spiegel affair in 1962, involving a government crackdown on the news magazine Der Spiegel for publishing critical articles about defense policy, highlighted challenges to traditional authority and concerns about democratic freedoms.
Yeah, and the student movement.
The student movement of the late 1960s grew significantly, part of a global trend. They protested against perceived authoritarian structures remaining from the Nazi era in universities and government, the Vietnam War, consumerism, and the general complacency of the older generation. It radicalized significantly after the police shooting of student protester Benno Ohnesorg during a demonstration in West Berlin in 1967, influenced by Marxist thinkers and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory.
And tragically, this radicalization, for a small minority, contributed to the emergence of domestic terrorism.
Yes, the Red Army faction, or RAF, also known as the Baader-Meinhof gang, after its early leaders Andreas Baader and Ulrich Meinhof, emerged from the fringes of this radicalized student environment in the early 1970s.
What did they do?
They rejected parliamentary democracy and engaged in a period of intense political violence through the 1970s and into the 80s, carrying out bank robberies, bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations of prominent figures they saw as representing the capitalist system, judges, businessmen, politicians. They called it armed struggle, a dark chapter.
A significant shift in foreign policy came with Willy Brandt, leader of the Social Democratic Party, SPD, and former governing mayor of West Berlin, becoming chancellor in 1969, leading the first SPD-led government. What was his signature policy?
That was his groundbreaking policy of Ostpolitik, meaning Eastern policy, a major departure from Adenauer's approach. Brandt pursued a path of dialogue, reconciliation, and practical cooperation with the GDR and the communist states of Eastern Europe, including Poland and the Soviet Union. Change through rapprochement was the idea.
What did this mean in practice?
It meant abandoning the Holstein Doctrine, negotiating treaties that recognized the post-war borders, like the Oder-Neisse line with Poland, a hugely sensitive issue, and establishing more normal relations with East Germany, though still stopping short of full diplomatic recognition initially. It aimed to ease Cold War tensions and improve human contacts across the divide. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for it in 1971.
But challenges persisted during this period. The sources mention the tragic attack at the 1972 Munich Olympics.
Yes, a horrific event during Brandt's chancellorship. Palestinian terrorists from the Black September group took Israeli athletes hostage, demanding the release of prisoners, including RAF leaders imprisoned in Germany. A botched rescue attempt led to the deaths of 11 Israeli athletes and coaches, and 1 German police officer. A global shock.
Brandt resigned in 1974 over a spy scandal and was succeeded by Helmut Schmidt, also SPD. The sources mention the German autumn of 1977 under Schmidt as a peak in RAF terrorism.
A real crisis for the West German state. The German autumn saw a dramatic escalation. The kidnapping and later murder of Hans-Martin Schleyer, head of the German Employers Association, and the hijacking of a Lufthansa passenger plane to Mogadishu, Somalia, demanding the release of imprisoned RAF leaders.
How did it end?
The crisis ended dramatically with the successful storming of the hijacked plane in Mogadishu by the elite German counterterrorism unit GSG-9, freeing the hostages. Shortly after, the imprisoned core RAF leaders, including Bader and Meinhof's successor Gudrun Ensslin, were found dead in their cells in Stammheim prison, officially ruled as collective suicide. Schleyer's body was then found. A traumatic period.
Helmut Schmidt remained chancellor until 1982, navigating economic challenges like the oil crises, later being replaced by Helmut Kohl of the CDU, marking a return to conservative leadership that would last for 16 years. Kohl faced economic challenges and intense debates over defense policy.
Especially the stationing of new U.S. intermediate-range nuclear missiles in West Germany in the early 80s, which sparked huge peace movement protests.
So by the mid-1980s, the division of Germany and Europe seemed deeply entrenched, permanent almost.
It certainly looked that way to many. The wall stood, the 2 German states seemed stable in their respective blocs, but fundamental change was brewing beneath the surface, especially in the late 1980s.
What drove that change?
Several factors. Mounting economic pressure and popular discontent within communist regimes across Eastern Europe, exemplified by the Solidarity movement in Poland, which had challenged the regime throughout the 80s. And crucially, the reforms taking place in the Soviet Union under its new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring.
Gorbachev's role was key.
Absolutely. He signaled that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to prop up the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, abandoning the Brezhnev Doctrine. This opened the floodgates for change.
This external pressure combined with growing internal unrest in East Germany. Why?
Persistent economic problems, environmental degradation, and especially the severe lack of freedoms compared to the West, particularly the freedom to travel. This led to a surge in citizens trying to leave, sometimes seeking asylum in West German embassies in Prague and Budapest. And, crucially, mass peaceful demonstrations grew within the GDR itself, most famously the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig, demanding reform and travel rights under the chant, Wir sind das Volk, we are the people.
The pressure became overwhelming.
It did. This pressure eventually led to the ousting of the hardline, aging East German leader Erich Honecker in October 1989. His successor, Egon Krenz, struggled to regain control.
And then came the pivotal, almost unbelievable moment on the evening of November 9, 1989. What happened?
It was almost accidental, triggered by a bungled announcement. Under immense pressure from the continuing protests and the exodus of citizens via Czechoslovakia and Hungary, which had opened its border with Austria, the East German government decided to ease travel restrictions.
How was it announced?
A mid-level party official, Günter Schabowski, announced the new regulations at a press conference. When asked when they would take effect, he seemed unprepared and stammered, "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately without delay."
Immediately.
That's what the news reported. Huge crowds of East Berliners surged towards the checkpoints along the Berlin Wall, demanding to be let through based on the announcement.
And the border guards.
They were completely overwhelmed, caught by surprise, without clear orders. Facing the massive, peaceful crowds chanting, "Open the gate," the commander at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, Harald Jäger, finally gave the order to open the barriers around 10:45 p.m.
And the sources paint that unforgettable picture.
Unforgettable scenes broadcast live around the world. Overwhelmed border guards stepping aside. Jubilant East and West Berliners streaming through, climbing onto the wall, embracing, crying, celebrating together with champagne and hammers. A spontaneous, joyous party that symbolized the end of the Cold War division. The wall had fallen.
The official end of border controls between the two Germanys followed swiftly in July 1990 with the introduction of monetary union. And the move to formal political reunification was incredibly swift after the wall opened.
Astonishingly swift, really, driven by popular pressure in the East. Wir sind ein Volk, we are one people. And Chancellor Kohl's political determination in the West, seizing the historic opportunity. International negotiations, the 2+4 agreement involving the two German states and the four former occupying powers, secured approval.
When did reunification happen?
The first and last, free elections in East Germany in March 1990 resulted in a victory for parties favoring rapid unification. Economic and monetary union happened in July, and on October 3, 1990, less than a year after the wall fell, Germany was officially reunified. The GDR ceased to exist, and its territory joined the Federal Republic.
Berlin was chosen as the capital again.
Yes, after a contentious debate in the Bundestag, Berlin was chosen as the capital of reunified Germany, though the move of government functions from Bonn took several years.
But the sources are clear that integrating the former East Germany, the Aufbau Ost, or rebuilding East, came with immense challenges and costs. It wasn't all smooth sailing.
Absolutely not. The challenges were enormous. The state-run industries in the East were largely obsolete, uncompetitive, and collapsed rapidly after monetary union, leading to massive job losses. Infrastructure, roads, railways, telecommunications needed huge modernization. Environmental damage from decades of neglect was severe.
What does it mean economically and socially?
It required pouring hundreds of billions of euros in investment and transfer payments from west to east over decades. The solidarity surcharge tax is still levied today. The transition was painful, leading to high unemployment and a sense of dislocation for many former East German workers, the Ossis, contributing to lingering economic and social disparities, the so-called wall in the head.
And there was a legal reckoning of sorts for figures from the former East German regime.
Yes, attempts were made to prosecute former leaders and officials. The sources briefly mention former SED party chiefs like Erich Honecker and the notorious Stasi director Erich Mielke facing charges for regime atrocities, like the orders to shoot escapees at the Berlin Wall. However, their fates vary due to factors like ill health, exile, Honecker died in Chile, or legal complexities. Many low-level border guards were convicted, but sentences were often light, a difficult process of coming to terms with the past.
Bringing our deep dive towards the present day, reunified Germany stands as a stable, prosperous, democratic nation at the very heart of the European Union.
Yes, a key player. A leading member of NATO and the G7-G8 group of leading industrial nations. A pillar of the European project.
The sources highlight Germany's central role within the EU.
It's undeniable. As a founding member of the EEC and now possessing the largest population and the most productive economy in the EU, Germany profoundly influences EU diplomacy, economic policy, especially regarding the Eurozone, defense cooperation, justice, and immigration policies. Its political stability and economic strength have been crucial anchor points for the EU, especially during crises.
The EU's own expansion after the Cold War, particularly incorporating former Warsaw Pact nations from Central and Eastern Europe.
A historic process strongly supported by Germany.
And the adoption of a single currency, the euro, in 2002, profoundly integrated the continent and significantly boosted trade and economic ties, especially for an export-oriented economy like Germany's.
Absolutely. And recent political figures have navigated Germany through significant global and domestic challenges since reunification. The sources briefly touch on Helmut Kohl overseeing the complex post-reunification integration challenges. His successor, Gerhard Schröder, SPD, implemented controversial labor market and welfare reforms known as Agenda 2010, aimed at boosting competitiveness, but also faced criticism.
Schröder's foreign policy shifted too.
Yes, he notably opposed the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, marking a more assertive stance. He also oversaw the first deployment of German combat troops abroad since WWII in Kosovo and Afghanistan, breaking a long-standing taboo. And he cultivated a close, though later controversial, relationship with Russia under Putin.
Then came Angela Merkel, CDU, chancellor from 2005 to 2021, a dominant figure.
Immensely influential, both domestically and internationally. She guided Germany and often Europe through the global financial crisis of 2008, the subsequent Eurozone debt crisis, insisting on austerity measures, and later the European migrant crisis of 2015-16 when Germany took in over 1 million refugees, a decision praised by some, criticized by others. Wir schaffen das. We can manage this. Known for her pragmatic, steady leadership style.
It's notable, too, as you mentioned with Schroeder, that Germany's armed forces, the Bundeswehr, now regularly participate in NATO and EU operations abroad in the Balkans, Afghanistan, Mali.
Yeah.
A significant shift reflecting Germany's changed role and responsibilities since reunification and the end of the Cold War.
A huge shift from the post-WWII era. And Merkel receiving the Charlemagne Prize, Aachen Prize, Europe's most prestigious award recognizing contributions to European unity alongside French presidents, also symbolizes the enduring Franco-German partnership. That relationship remains a crucial engine underpinning the EU.
Wow, what an incredible, complex, often turbulent journey we've taken in this deep dive. From those ancient origins, tribal societies, through empires, Roman and Holy Roman, fragmentation, the Reformation, devastating wars like the 30 Years' War, the World Wars, the stark division of the Cold War, and ultimately reunification and a leading role in a transformed Europe.
It really underscores how the identity of this land and its people has always been dynamic, constantly in flux, constructed and reconstructed in different eras. Shaped profoundly by its central geography, that crossroads status, its internal conflicts, the weight of its history, and the continuous movement of peoples and ideas across its often shifting borders.
Understanding this deep, complex history, with all its triumphs and tragedies, the cultural achievements, the philosophical heights, but also the catastrophes and the crimes, provides absolutely essential context for understanding Germany's role, its responsibilities, and its anxieties in the world today. How it interacts with its neighbors, how it views itself.
Absolutely. And given this long history of fluid borders, shifting identities, external influences constantly shaping the nation, and periods of both fragmentation and strong central power, here's maybe a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to consider. What does it truly mean to be Germany or German in the 21st century? In a nation now deeply embedded within a larger European identity, still a crossroads of cultures, carrying the unique burdens and lessons of its past, and facing new global challenges. How does that incredibly layered history continue to shape the ongoing construction of identity in this united, yet still diverse country and continent?
That's a powerful question to sit with. There are no easy answers there. We hope this deep dive has given you some fascinating insights and plenty of context to think about. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper into the incredible layers of this history.